My name is Richard Morellis, and I want to welcome you to the Prison Post. This is your podcast for conversations surrounding the need to reform prisons from the perspectives of formerly incarcerated people, community members, and leaders in the restorative justice movement. The Prison Post will feature an episode every Wednesday with people who are in the fight to restore lives and heal communities. Welcome to the Prison Post. My name is Richard Morellis, and this is my co-host, Jason Bryant.
Hello, everyone.
We want to welcome Taina Vargas to the Prison Post this week. She's the co-founder and executive director from Initiate Justice. Good afternoon, Taina.
Good afternoon, Rich and Jason. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Yeah.
I just want to share a little bit about your background before we get started. You founded Initiate Justice in September of 2016 with the intention of activating the political power of people directly impacted by mass incarceration. Prior to creating Initiate Justice, you worked in organizing and policy advocacy field. In the organizing and policy advocacy field as a statewide advocacy coordinator with the SC Justice Group, a state campaigner with Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and as a field representative for the California State Assembly. You were directly impacted by mass incarceration by having a loved one who was incarcerated for over 7 years. So you're exactly the type of person that we want to be interviewing on the Prison Post, is working hard to restore lives. I mean, I look at you as a leader, somebody that I admire. So many of my friends at the CROP organization, we respect you and admire you, the work that you do. And it's been great working with you over the last year. Maybe we could talk about that in a few minutes, but so welcome.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So first of all, I want to start off by saying that I follow you on Instagram, but it's not as the advocacy, not only as the advocacy leader in the prison reform movement, but at Cupcakes of Color.
Cupcakes of Color.
Cupcakes of Color. Cupcakes.of.color.
Yes.
And so when I look at your pictures on Cupcakes of Color, I see like these beautiful cupcakes, and it looks so cathartic and therapeutic. And I'm just curious of, is that a side thing that you do to relieve the stress, or what's going on there?
Absolutely. That's so funny. I had no idea this is where we were starting, but I am happy to talk about baking. Anybody who knows me, once you get me started, it might be hard to stop. So y'all will have to be good.
Okay.
No, but it's true. There's actually a lot of studies that show that baking is a meditative practice. And it's something that I enjoy very much. I feel like it's very good for my, mental and emotional well-being. Doing this work, like both being directly impacted by mass incarceration and then, constantly in the thick of the organizing work to end it. It can be very stressful. It can, hurt in very personal ways often. So, baking is something that I do to try and relieve the stress. And I also encourage everybody who's in this work to find something that makes you happy and incorporate it into your life.
Well, my question for you is, do you need any taste testers or samplers of your cupcakes? Because I was looking at them as well, and they're delicious. They look delicious.
The problem is I'm in LA and y'all are in Sacramento, and I don't think they would ship well.
Okay.
Oh.
Kind of like once you make it, you got to eat it type thing?
It's that kind of thing. But, if y'all are ever in the area, feel free to hit me up.
Sounds great.
Well, pre-COVID, she was out here at least once a month, so we may have to make an order eventually.
That's great.
That's pretty cool. Is that where the magic happens back there in the background? The Initiate Justice colored wall back there?
Right. This is my dining room and kitchen behind me. So correct. This is where the cupcake magic happens.
That's right.
All right.
Awesome.
That's really cool to have something therapeutic that you're passionate about to relieve the stress.
Yeah.
Because this is tough work, and you're one of the leaders of it. And I want to express gratitude on behalf of myself, Jason, Crop, and the other brothers and sisters who are incarcerated. I remember when Prop 57, you were working hard on Prop 57, the early days of Initiate Justice, and organizing and picking up people to go to the Capitol to go and speak to different senators and assembly persons. And it had Prop 57 not passed, my earliest release date for going to the board was December of 2021. But instead of having to go after 21 years, I was able to get to the board because of Prop 57 and after 19 years and 3 months. And I know that you had played a major part in that for me and for other people that I know that were sentenced to life terms. So I just wanted to say thank you, Taina.
Of course. I feel like it's our duty, And as you mentioned earlier, I also had a loved one inside who was able to earn almost 2 years off of his sentence due to Prop 57. So it was deeply personal to me.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. What about your upbringing? Did you grow up in California, or how did the trajectory of your life lead you to becoming a part of this work?
Yeah, so I'm born and raised here in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley, to be exact. Shout out to everybody from the Valley. But I, was directly impacted by the government's policies of, divesting from community-based services and investing in the prison industrial complex. Both of my parents had drug and alcohol addiction issues. We suffered from poverty and spent many of my years of my childhood homeless, actually. My dad was incarcerated when I was 14, and, my mom was still struggling with addiction issues. So I ended up starting to work so that I could, help pay for our rent and bills and, school supplies for my siblings. And I learned at a very young age that the system that we have is not working. My family was in crisis, moving through poverty and addiction and violence and trauma, but we didn't have any resources offered to us. Something that I think about often is my dad went to jail, as I said, when I was 14, and I just sank into a really deep depression. Our family was living in motels at the time. I just didn't know what to do. So I ended up ditching school. Most of my ninth grade year, I didn't even go to school, failed most of my classes. And not once did a teacher or a school counselor or anybody intervene to ask me, what was wrong, what was going on. The first intervention that I had was from the police. One day when I actually got late to school. It was one day that I was not ditching, but I got there late, and the police stopped me and they gave me a ticket for truancy. And this is something that, was a common practice at the time, something that was famously championed by then San Francisco District Attorney Kamala Harris. And, that had a material impact on my life. So I think, at that time, like that was a lesson for me that the only time, me personally or my family was going to receive any intervention was through the police. And then after my dad got out of jail, he ended up going to rehab, and that was how he got sober. But he had to go to jail first. He had to spend 10 months incarcerated in county jail, unable to support his family before he was offered any rehabilitative services. So growing up, I feel like that was a lesson that was ingrained in me, that something needed to change within our system, where we needed to offer people the support and the resources that they actually need. Because, the unfortunate truth in most of our communities, the first and last resource is just the police, prison, and jail.
Yeah, I also grew up in something similar, a similar environment, and I don't remember there ever being resources as well for any of those things throughout school, junior high, high school. The closest thing I remember in the '80s is like the Say No to Drugs campaign. But what about you, Jason? You're not too far away from the Valley there.
Well, yeah, I was born in Tarzana and raised.
Where I live now.
Oh, okay. It's indeed a small world. And I was actually raised in Palmdale, a little town outside of Palmdale called Acton, actually. And, there wasn't a lot of diversity, ethnic diversity in Acton. It was, primarily white. And I don't remember there being those type of services there, but there also weren't those type of issues. A lot of the issues with substance abuse, they weren't going on in the small town, which I was raised in. That being said, I definitely, once my freshman year of high school, I went to Palmdale High, and there was a significant shift. There was a lot more diversity in the ethnic composition of the school. And that's when I first had my first like real exposure to people that struggled with addiction. And, just to validate the point that Taina made, there wasn't like counselors running around trying to help these people, these young people or the older people. It was like, okay, well, you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do. And when you get caught for doing something wrong, you're going to be incarcerated. You're going to suffer the consequence. So I did witness that.
Exactly.
I think part of the inspiration behind the Prison Post and even the CROP organization that sponsors the Prison Post is being somebody who's proactive, being somebody who's willing to get in the fight. That's don't just complain about it. Notice the problem, see the problem, find a solution. What's the solution? And ever since I've known you, I've always seen like, hey, that you organize people to advocate for what's right, for what's just, what's good. Is that around the time, was it around high school when you started becoming passionate in that way?
No, actually, going through most of high school and even undergrad and college, I thought that the best way that I could change things was more from like a top-down approach. So I actually went to school for political science, and I went to graduate school for diplomacy and international relations. And I just thought, okay, I'll be a policy person and, just change laws from the top down. And, that's how we'll accomplish the social justice, goals that I was looking for. But it wasn't until I was 23 when my loved one went to prison that I kind of like I had to shift my perspective. And I still believed that we needed laws that needed to be changed, but laws were not going to change just by having, one or two elected officials or decision makers at the top calling those shots. What we actually needed to do is build people power and, develop and invest in the skills of people who are directly impacted by an issue to shift policy. As you had mentioned in my bio, I had also worked for the legislature for a period of time. And, that was something that I also learned in that experience, is that it's often the people with the most privilege or, resources who have the most influence, but they're not the people who have the most experience when it comes to ending mass incarceration. So I decided to initiate justice as a way of building that bridge between impacted people who are the experts of our own experiences, but systemically are kept out of the political process, and offering like those skills and that information so that we can be seen as the leaders that we truly are.
What do you think, Taina, is the reason that people who are impacted by the system are kept out of participation in it?
For any system of oppression to exist, it has to make the people who are oppressed feel like they're powerless. Because, we have strength in numbers. There's, about 100,000 people in California state prisons, which incidentally is the lowest number in the last 30 years. There are about 80,000 people incarcerated in county jails. And if you multiply that by their family members, close friends, loved ones, there are millions and millions of people in California who are directly impacted by mass incarceration one way or the other. And the system has to make us feel like we don't have a voice in order for it to continue to exist. If all of those millions of people, had the skills and the resources and the influence that some of the people at the top do, then the prison walls would come crumbling down in a second.
What do you think the motivation of those people at the top is?
Because they don't want to lose their power. There's a lot of power and money to be made in the mass incarceration system. And I know folks will often talk about the financial aspects, but I like to focus more on the power that is held at the top. This system exists because folks are able to sell fear and say that, people in prison are dangerous and violent and scary. And by capitalizing on that fear, they're able to create entire systems of control where you have legislators and voters who are willing to put policies in place that will lock people away for a long period of time just because they're scared. Without thinking about the material impacts that that's having on families and communities and on public safety.
Sure.
We're close to 30 years into this tough on crime period now, and it's very clear that harsher punishment does not make us safer. It actually makes us less safe. But the powers that be, I think, like to be able to be in control of the narrative. And, until we can take that narrative back and uplift the stories of, folks like you who were incarcerated for, a long period of time, folks who we've been conditioned to be afraid of, folks like me who were, seen as, I don't know, foolish or, uneducated because we support people who are in prison. I think it's really important for us to continue to do the work to debunk those myths.
Taina, everything that you're sharing has led to what you've mentioned already in this conversation is called mass incarceration. I know that your mission, part of your mission with Initiate Justice, is to end mass incarceration. You know, I was having a conversation about this with a loved one just yesterday on the phone, and they didn't even know what mass incarceration was. And part of our listeners are loved ones of the incarcerated, family members, friends, and those who are interested in this arena of getting involved and making a difference. So what is mass incarceration, and how do you activate the political power of the people that it directly impacts?
Thanks for that question. Mass incarceration is, it's an entire system of, policies and practices and funding streams that are in place that lock up a mass amount of people for the intention of maintaining this system of punishment and control. The prison system is supposed to exist to keep communities safe. However, the United States has the highest incarceration rates in the world, and also has some of the highest rates of, violent crime in the world. Our prison population has skyrocketed over the last 30 years, and that has not been in a response to threats to public safety. That has been in response to, criminalizing Black and brown folks, criminalizing drug use, and with the intention of making money and maintaining control over mass amounts of people. So when I say we activate the political power of impacted people, that means that we organize people who are in prison, formerly incarcerated people, and their loved ones to fight for laws that will bring people home from prison, and will also create restorative justice alternatives that actually focus on keeping communities safe, repairing harm once it is caused, but first and foremost, ensuring that we have resources and social services in our communities so that we can care for people in the first place, so they don't end up causing harm that might end up leading them to prison.
What are your thoughts about violent crime?
I think that all of us want to be safe, right? I'll speak in particular as a woman who on a day-to-day basis, faces sexual harassment and catcalling and, all the things. So I think there's this idea that those of us who are prison abolitionists, I am an abolitionist, which means that I believe in completely dismantling the existing punishment system that we have and replacing it with something that truly keeps us safe and invests in communities. But when I think about violent crime, I think that the system that we have now is not doing a good job of preventing it. I do not feel safe because I know we have mandatory minimums or 3 strikes law or death penalty. I would feel safer if I knew that people who have faced violence as children are getting access to therapy and trauma-informed care so that they don't end up committing violence when they get older. I would like to think that children who, similarly children who are victims of sexual assault are also getting care that they need so they don't end up perpetuating sexual assault when they get older. I would like to think that we have a universal basic income so that people don't have to resort to robbery and things like that. So I think that, the question of, well, what do you think about violent crime, or, what do we do with people who commit violence? I think we're kind of missing the mark because the system itself is violent and is creating violence and is perpetuating violence. So I think that, the first step is to alter our system so that we can create a safer environment, and then put in place transformative and restorative mechanisms of holding people accountable when they do still cause harm. Because regardless, it's a fact that we have to face that even if we did abolish prisons and had a completely different system in place, there are still outliers. There are still people who will cause harm. And we can find ways of, keeping the community safe without resorting to this, intricate web of punishment that wraps so many people up in it.
Do you think that, and I asked this question because I was watching something, I think it was TikTok. And one of the points that was made by someone on the kind of the other side of the aisle was that culture has something to do with it as well. Do you agree with that, or do you disagree? that there's something with inner city culture that kind of promotes violence in some ways, and perhaps crime in general?
I think that that's a racist assessment.
Mhm.
I think that American culture, period, promotes violence. We have the
Mhm.
largest military in the world.
Sure.
So, how are we gonna say that, quote unquote, inner city, which let's be real, that's like a tag word. They mean Black and brown communities.
Mhm.
um, say that our communities promote violence when our communities have not been invested in.
Mm.
Most of us are here because our ancestors are we're enslaved and we're literally kidnapped and we're not given, wealth or opportunities. So, we are doing our best to deal with the hand that we were given in the
Mm.
context of an incredibly violent culture. So
Sure.
if we respond with, our best survival mechanisms, I think that that's what any community would do,
Taina.
But why aren't we talking about violence? We don't talk about mass shootings in the same way that for the most part are, committed by white men. We don't talk about white on white crime when all of the statistics show that violence is mostly going to happen within communities. So if it's a Black community, a Latinx community, an Indigenous community, a white community, it's most likely going to be amongst people that you know. But we
Sure.
only hear about Black on Black crime in the news. So I think that I would just want to highlight some of the racist intentions around that kind of coded language.
Taina, I appreciate you sharing with this and unpacking what abolitionism is. There's people that we've talked to, been in conversations with, and they think it means and that, oh, just close all prisons right now and release everybody. And you've already unpacked some of what it really means. But what would be some type of 5-year plan or 20-year plan so that this idea of ending prisons isn't just some utopian thought?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So, Initiate Justice is actually going to be launching a report in January 2021, outlining some of the first steps that we think are really important towards achieving prison abolition. But some things that I'll list now is, I'll talk about Prop 57 as an example. I see something like Prop 57 as an abolitionist reform, because what it ultimately does is it does help, get people out of prison by incentivizing positive behavior that's going to lower recidivism and help keep people out and help them be positive members of society, by offering a credit earning system for completing educational and rehabilitative programs. Is like a really important first step that the state took to reduce the population while improving public safety. But a few other things that I think are really important are, one, we need to end extreme sentencing. It's just a fact that people are in prison for far too long. We
Mm.
have, mandatory sentences and enhancements such as the 3 strikes law, the death penalty, life without the possibility of parole, people who have received multiple life sentences for, things that are also relatively small, but we just have so much, I don't know, for lack of a better word, junk that needs to be cleaned up in our penal code that it's really, far too easy to receive an extreme sentence in California. The second thing that I think we need to do, and this is kind of tied in with the Prop 57 piece, is increase access to programs and credits. So for the folks who are inside right now, our system needs to do a much better job of equipping people with the tools and the skills that they need to be able to reenter society successfully. But that doesn't, just mean job training or education. That also means, trauma therapy. Folks inside are going to need a lot of support transitioning back to the outside. And that brings me to the third thing that I think we really need to focus on, which is improving access between incarcerated people and their loved ones on the outside. All of the research shows that folks inside, program better when they have people on the outside who care about them. They're less likely to be involved in, anything dangerous while they're inside. And then they also re-enter society more successfully when they have a family and a community who cares for them.
Exactly.
And the prison system does everything within its power to keep families apart. There are many things that I think need to happen over the next 5-10 years, but the 3 major things that I would highlight are ending extreme sentencing, increasing access to program and credits, and improving connections between incarcerated people and their loved ones.
Thank you for sharing that. I remember being in the visiting room and them getting on me for hugging my mom for more than 10 seconds.
Right.
And it was like, this is my mom. I mean, look at the paperwork. What is the harm in hugging my mom? Well, you get one hug at the beginning and one hug at the end. And
Right.
it seems that their whole perspective is skewed in that way. You know, me and Jason here, we have 41 years in between us. And one of the things that I know about Initiate Justice that I don't think any other nonprofit organization is doing is like you said, activating the power of the people that are on the inside as well. We were a part of the inside organizing team, some of the early teams inside Soledad. I remember going to Night Yard. Jason actually was the lead inside organizer.
I was the lead organizer for
Initiate.
for a little while. Yes.
Nice.
And I remember going to Night Yard sometimes, and it'd be raining. And a lot of guys in prison don't like going out in the rain. But I remember we were out there sometimes 8 of us or 7 of us or 15 of us, and we were talking about policy. And I don't know if anybody else, see guys on the inside, I remember saying, well, they ought to do this and they ought to do this law and create this so that we could have this access or have this program so we could get out sooner or incentivize prison. But we never heard of any organizations reaching into the inside and saying, what do you guys want?
Right.
What do you guys see that would improve the system, or what are your guys' thoughts on mandatory minimums? But Initiate Justice did that. I know that today you have 28,000. I looked at the website this morning, 28,475 members of Initiate Justice on the inside, 135 inside organizers of what Jason was rallying the guys together to come and get ideas. So first of all, I want to say thank you for letting us have a voice on what we believe is best to reform the prison system that's so broken in mass incarceration. And second, how did you get that idea to care about our voices from the inside?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And, shout out to the both of you for, being some of our first inside organizers and members. And that was where it all started, with just a couple of folks at Soledad State Prison who, got organized and believed in the mission. But, as I had mentioned, I do have, my experiences with the prison system, and my loved one has his experiences with the prison system. But I also recognize that, my experience was not everyone else's experience. And my loved one's sentence and his experience was not the same as everybody else's. So for me, it felt very important to reach as many people in prison as possible, understanding that incarcerated people are the experts of their own experiences, and, tapping in and asking those types of questions. And I learned so much. There's so many things that I would never have thought of, just by, hearing people's stories and hearing what kind of sentences they received and how they've been treated since they've been inside, and, different laws that had impacted them, and, the issues that were a priority for them. It doesn't seem authentic to, claim to be an organization working to end mass incarceration if you're not directly tapping in with the people most intimately affected by it. Sometimes I'll hear things where, even well-intentioned folks on the outside will say, well, we are their voice and, I'm speaking for them, but that's absolutely unnecessary. People are incarcerated. They're not dead. They can still, think and talk. And, there's plenty of ways, we have to be creative. We have to organize around the bureaucratic and punitive prison system. But it's, 1000% possible to tap in with folks inside and, learn from their experiences and develop our legislation and develop our demands around what the folks inside are saying are the top priorities.
What was the biggest obstacle for you in getting all of this started?
So this is something that I always joke around and say, I never wanted to run a nonprofit. It's not fun. It's not sexy. I don't enjoy fundraising. I hate grant writing. I hate, all of the bureaucratic things that come with it.
Right.
So, I think it's kind of unfortunate that the best way to do this work is within this kind of like nonprofit industrial complex where, there's just like so many obstacles that are in the way at times, when you want to fight for the radical change that you want. But, some other challenges were, of course, around navigating the prison system. mail would go missing that we were sending to our inside organizers. And, sometimes we would hear from folks saying that, their property or organizing materials were taken away. But a way that we were able to get around that for the most part was we also developed a professional relationship with CDCR headquarters in Sacramento, so that when those issues did arise, we were able to take it straight to the administration and say, hey, this is happening here. Initiate Justice is not doing anything to violate any rules. We're not doing anything to threaten any safety. So, can y'all help us with this? And, for the most part, the advocacy through that avenue was successful. But, and then sometimes we still face challenges from opposition where they don't, believe in the validity and the experiences of directly impacted people. But that's just a narrative that we got to keep fighting against.
I asked that question because I remember one of the biggest obstacles in organizing on the inside. And initially it was getting guys to believe that change was possible.
Right.
And I think that's a reflection upon the sense of despair for many people who are incarcerated. Like, this is just how it is. Nothing's ever going to change. Who are we? How could our voice ever matter? Right. And just to mirror what Rich said, we have an abundance of gratitude for you for helping us while we were inside to get our voice back.
I got to admit a guilt on one of those. We were having a meeting. I don't know if Jason was the one organizing it, but I believe he was there. And we were doing a survey for Initiate Justice and talking about some of the things that we would want on next year's ballot. And one of them,
and it was a lightweight competition between prisons too, because remember, like the best idea is what we're going to move forward with.
Right. It was like us against San Quentin. Yeah. And, we definitely didn't want them to win. But in the reality, we all would have won, but we all are winning.
Right.
And we'll talk about that right now. But one of the ideas that came out, and I remember, it was that let's fight for those on parole to vote, for the right for those on parole to vote. I'm like, why are we wasting our time with that?
It'll never happen, right?
It'll never happen. The voters are not gonna vote for that. I mean, they're gonna laugh us out of there. That's one of those things like, ending the 3 strikes law is like, it takes so much to do, requires a 2/3 vote. And in fact, it was like, there's a verse in the Bible where this guy says, Lord, I believe, but help me with my unbelief. I had unbelief at the time. I got out last year, March 20th, 2019, last year, March 20th. And I called you on day 2 and called you and your loved one on day 2. We had a great conversation. 10 days later, we're in the Capitol advocating for a bill for AB 965 for time credits for youthful offenders. And about 90 days later, you asked if I'd be willing to share at a press conference for another bill called ACA 6.
Right.
And would you be willing to share what ACA 6 was, what's happened since then, how unprecedented it was for it to go on to pass, and now what it is today?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say I had my fair share of naysayers on the outside too. Right. I had plenty of funders and, people at other organizations, even people who I was like, dang, I thought y'all were my friends, telling me, Taina, what are you doing? You don't have the money for this. You don't know what you're doing. You're not going to be able to get to qualify a ballot initiative to restore voting rights. Fast forward a few years later, here we are. We have Prop 17. So ACA 6, which you mentioned, Richard, was an assembly constitutional amendment, which means it was something that went through the legislature to place an initiative on the statewide ballot that will restore voting rights to people on parole. So if I could back up a little bit, initially in 2017, I had heard from one of our inside organizers at San Quentin, who's now on our board of directors. His name is Rasan Thomas. And he had called me one day and said, if Initiate Justice really cares about activating the political power of people impacted by incarceration, step 1, we need the right to vote. So we tried to collect signatures to get something on the ballot in 2018 that would have restored voting rights to people in prison and people on parole. We were still very new and underfunded, and everybody doubted us at the time. So we collected 25,000 signatures, which was great, but we did not get the full amount of signatures that we needed to qualify for the ballot. However, we did get the attention of the legislature, in particular, Assembly Member Kevin McCarty, who also represents the Sacramento area, reached out and said, I'm willing to author a constitutional amendment to place something on the ballot, but let's take it one step at a time and just focus on people on parole. So ACA 6 was introduced in January of 2019. And, we co-created a coalition of many organizations such as ACLU, League of Women Voters, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Californians United for a Responsible Budget, so many organizations. The Secretary of State of California is also a co-sponsor of the bill. Everybody came together behind this idea, and we mobilized people in prison. We mobilized, folks like you, Richard, who had just come home to, share their stories about, being on parole and why it's important to have the right to vote. And we fought for 18 months to get the 2/3 vote that we needed in both the Assembly and the Senate. We scraped by with bipartisan support in both houses. And in June, ACA 6 passed the legislature and became Prop 17. So now every voter in the state of California will have the opportunity to vote November 3rd. Yes, on Prop 17, which will restore voting rights for people on parole in the state of California. And then California will become the 20th state that automatically restores voting rights after incarceration.
Right on. For me, I've never been able to. I'm 42 years old now, and I've never voted once my whole life. I was incarcerated all my 20s, all my 30s, never had a chance to vote. There's an old line that comes to mind, and I think you have it on your website as well. No taxation without representation.
Right.
And I feel like I did nearly 21 years in there. I feel like I served my time. I'm a citizen of this country. I came out. I paid taxes. It's been going on 17 months now. I work hard. I volunteer in the community. I speak at recovery groups, at churches, and I feel like I'm living life as a returning citizen should. And to still continue the punishment of not being able to vote doesn't seem right. It doesn't make sense to me. It seems like some archaic bill to continue to oppress. I remember going back in there on the discussion with you and Initiate Justice and on behalf of CROP. And I remember one of the assembly members saying, no, you're not done being punished. You need another 3 years or 5 years or 7 years to continue the punishment. And, it's tough enough to get an apartment or to get a credit card or to get a bank account. And that's just another thing, to another right that they want to take because they continue to think that you need to continue to be punished. And if he knew what it was like to live for 6 months in there, much less 1 week, I don't think he would be saying that. That's my personal opinion.
No, I agree with that. And I also think that, it's very sad that your story, Richard, is not unique. There are so many people who have never had the right to vote because they were incarcerated young and spent so much time inside. And then, when folks get out, they have the potential for being on parole for the rest of their lives. It depends on, what your underlying sentence was, but there are thousands of people who come out every year who are on life parole and, could potentially lose their right to vote forever. The United States is actually the only democracy in the world where people can lose their right to vote forever because of a felony conviction. So we're, a real outlier and not in a good way. I agree with everything that you were saying, Richard, about, you being home and being a taxpayer and a contributing member of society. But I would even take it a step further and say, folks who are in prison are also contributing members to society. And one of the surveys that Initiate Justice did was our Democracy Needs Everyone survey, where we, asked people in prison and on parole, like, if you could vote, would you? What policy priorities are important to you? What do you think we need to accomplish to achieve public safety? And, also, like, what are you doing to contribute to your communities? And what we learned was that over 50% of people were in rehabilitative programs or mentoring others. Over 60% of people were in school. Over 70% of people were doing some kind of job or vocational training. And then we also just got all of these like anecdotal stories about people in prison knitting blankets to donate to homeless shelters, or, translating books into Braille for blind people, just like all of these ways that the folks inside are still part of their communities within the system, but also contributing members on the outside. So I think that it's really important for us to remember, again, that people in prison are still people, are still community members, even if, the way that they're involved in the community looks a little bit different now. But if you are, a United States citizen over the age of 18, you should have your right to vote, period.
What about people like me and Jason, or people that we know, they want to get involved? We know that for something like this to get on TV, there'll be ads coming up against it. We know there's a lot of money that's involved. How does a person sign up? What could they do? What could they do to be a part of Prop 17 passing?
Yes, so please visit yeson17.vote. That's the official campaign website. And the first thing that people can do is donate to support our campaign. This is a real grassroots effort. We don't have, a ton of huge funders or donors or anything like that. This effort is led by people who are directly impacted, by people who are formerly incarcerated, and, by a bunch of like really dope allies who are, leading a really strong effort to restore voting rights. So I would encourage people again to visit yeson17.vote and donate to contribute.
You got anything on that, Jay?
Oh, well, I had some other questions, interesting stuff just on my mind right now. So you're obviously a prolific leader in the social justice movement, and I have a question. So what are your thoughts about the police force, and what needs to be improved with law enforcement?
I feel the same way about police that I do about prisons, that
Okay.
we need to abolish the police. Again, police are also supposed to be a mechanism of, uplifting and protecting public safety.
Mhm.
But, often what we find is that more police does not equal public safety.
Sure.
The communities that are the safest are not the communities that have the most police. They're the communities that have the most resources.
Mm.
I think about growing up in Los Angeles, where the LA Unified School District is one of the few jurisdictions in the country that actually has its own police force. So LAUSD has a police department outside of LAPD or the LA Sheriff's Department. And I think that just goes to show you, like how we are approaching caring for children. We have like police officers in preschools and kindergartens
Right.
in Los Angeles, arresting kids who the handcuffs are too big to even fit them. I got put in handcuffs at the age of 16 when I was in school for violating the dress code. So I think that, what we really need to be doing is like setting up mechanisms in place, again, where we are actually just like addressing root causes and taking care of the community and setting people up to win by really investing in what we need. And, I'll give a shout out to another ballot measure here in Los Angeles County, which right now is being referred to as the Reimagine LA ballot measure, that will divert 10% of our county's discretionary fund to alternatives to incarceration and affordable housing, which are two huge areas of concern here in Los Angeles. And there's also a stipulation in that ballot measure saying that those funds cannot be used for law enforcement. And I think that it's important that this is like a really key first step for us to start shifting resources away from, just the police and guns and violence and arresting people out of a problem.
Because that hasn't worked.
It hasn't worked.
Sure.
It hasn't worked. And I think that, we're, maybe if you think about it, just off top, like, oh yeah, if someone, does something bad, there should be someone with a gun who can enforce a law and, put them in a cage so that we can all be safe. But what we've learned is that it's not working.
Right.
We don't,
and they don't need tanks to do that.
They don't.
Or RVs and fully automatic weapons. So, yeah.
No, so many of our communities look like war zones.
Mm-hmm. And who are they at war against?
Right. Like, aren't they supposed to be protecting us?
Exactly.
We're community members too, right?
That's what's up. That's right. That's right. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me. Just the whole militarization is just gone out of control. I mean, it may have started out with, well, let's get this, and now it's like a military unto itself.
Right.
So, yeah, that's the conversation about defunding the police, and I think that on both sides of the fence, that on the one hand, those who believe in defunding the police, I would love for them to really spell out, sort of like you did earlier for abolitionism. Here's what we believe. Here's our definition. Here's what we believe. Here's a 4-point or 10-point plan over this amount of time. Obviously, it doesn't mean end all police forces right now.
Right. It's not that simple.
Yeah, it's not
Right.
that simple, and that's how some people try to frame it. And they use a straw man argument to tear it down.
Right.
Like,
Right.
oh, they mean do this, and I hate, and I don't agree with that. Well, that's not what they're saying. So let's listen and get both people in the room and start listening to each other. And maybe, when I shared with somebody the other day what some of your ideas were on abolitionism, when they found out I was going to interview you, and he's like, oh, I don't agree with her. By the time I explained most of what you said, he goes, oh, I agree.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Because we
Sure.
believe the same thing.
So, and that goes to another question. Like when we're using language like this, Taina, do you believe that we have some responsibility to be clear about what people are getting, or like part of what I thought was when I first heard it was, even though it may seem a little bit unrealistic to say abolish prisons right now, like the shock value would encourage people to like maybe meet halfway and say, okay, well, we definitely need to do something different than what we've been doing. Is that the rationale in using such strong language?
I would say yes and no, that it is the responsibility of advocates to spell these things out. Like, of course, if there's something that we are pushing for, we should be well informed and, be using, data and research to, inform the policies that we are advocating for. However, I will also add that I believe that it's incumbent upon the system to invest resources in research. We have all of the resources to fund the police and to fund prisons, and, for policymakers to, sit in their chairs and say, well, we don't really know what else is going to work, so let's keep going with, what is clearly failing. I think that we need to have some pilot projects where we are, trying new things in different regions, and those are, fully funded by the government. There's a bill moving through the legislature now, introduced by Assemblymember Kamlager, called the Crises Act, AB 2054, which would create a funding mechanism to pilot restorative justice and alternative to police programs in a few jurisdictions in California. And even here in LA County, through the county, we have an alternatives to incarceration work group that's funded by the county, where we have researchers, data analysts, and community members and advocates who put together a solid report of how we can close down jails in Los Angeles County and what alternatives to incarceration we need to be investing in. So I say, yes, it's on the advocates, but it's also on the state and the powers that be to give us the tools that we need and the resources to be able to tap into that radical imagination.
Awesome.
Taina, we're coming in the hour. We know you're a very busy woman and have a lot of things on your plate, but I would like to ask, are there any, for the family members and friends of the incarcerated listening, are there any bills? I think COVID has kind of separated many of us, for being in the know on what the latest bills are for 2020, 2021. What could they look out for? How could, how are laws being done right now with in the state of COVID? Anything you could share on that?
Right. Well, due to COVID, unfortunately, many pieces of legislation, including two of the ones Initiate Justice was co-sponsoring, ended up getting dropped by the legislature. However, for 2020, I do encourage folks to vote yes on Prop 17, register to vote. You can visit the California Secretary of State's website to make sure that you're registered to vote. If you have moved, you can go on the Secretary of State's website to change your address, check your voter registration status, do all of that. Because of COVID, all of the election is going to be a vote by mail election. So make sure that you're doing everything in your power to make sure that your voter registration information is accurate and up to date, and that you get your ballot in the mail. And to be clear, you can vote even if you have a felony conviction, as long as you're not on parole. So people on probation can vote, people on post release community supervision can vote. People who have old felonies who are no longer on parole can vote. The only people who cannot vote because of a felony conviction in California are people who are currently on parole right now. So as long as you are not on parole right now, make sure that you are registered to vote. And vote by mail ballots are going to be going out October 5th. So, turn it in early, make sure it gets counted. And next year, Initiate Justice does plan to introduce legislation on the 3 steps to abolition that I addressed earlier, which are around ending extreme sentencing, increasing access to programming and credits, and improving connections between incarcerated people and their loved ones. And if you want to be involved in Initiate Justice, you can sign up as a member on the outside, or you can sign up your incarcerated loved one to receive our newsletter. Just visit initiatejustice.org and click our Take Action button, and you can sign up yourself or your loved one for our membership.
Excellent.
Excellent. I actually have one of your t-shirts here.
Hey.
How did you get that t-shirt, Rich? Oh,
I can see it.
that's because you and I are in the Institute of we're in the Institute of Impacted Leaders.
Yep. Every
Tuesday.
Every Tuesday night. And you can only miss 2. Would you talk about Institute of Impacted Leaders real quick and how people can get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ways that we build the power of directly impacted people is by a 12-week organizing and advocacy training program that we have called the Institute of Impacted Leaders. So this is for formerly incarcerated folks and people with incarcerated loved ones to learn the basics of community organizing, statewide legislative advocacy, and how to legally and safely fight for your rights, both in and out of prison. So we gather cohorts based on region. And work through the 12-week program. So last year, we graduated 2 cohorts of folks in Los Angeles and 1 in Oakland. And this year, of course, due to COVID, we've had to transition online. So now it's actually called the Zoom Institute of Impacted Leaders. We're doing everything on Zoom, but we're running a cohort in Sacramento, which, the 2 of you are a part of, and love seeing you every week, and a cohort in the Inland Empire. Our next Zoom Institutes will be launching in early 2021. So keep an eye out for the applications on the Initiate Justice website and on all of our social media platforms. So we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, just at Initiate Justice. And if you are someone who is either formerly incarcerated or has an incarcerated loved one, or both, I hope that you will sign up. The regions that we're hoping to move to next year are Central California, come back to Los Angeles, and then maybe move to other areas such as like San Diego, Central Coast, Orange County. But yeah, do y'all have anything that you want to share about the Institute as ongoing participants?
Well, I'll say that it's incredibly enlightening. There are things that I was completely unaware of in regards to the rights that I have and how to advocate in an effective manner. So it's very informative, very interesting. It's facilitated incredibly well. And I'm not just saying that because you're our guest today. You do a great job facilitating, and your co-facilitators as well. But it's definitely worth the investment of time.
It's definitely, I'm zoomed out, and but it's the best thing I've been on Zoom, the most clear. And I never realized how difficult it was to get a law. First of all, even to be looked at, secondly, to be passed. And so thank you for your work. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for joining us on the Prison Post today. It's been a great conversation with you. We definitely want to welcome you back at another time for future laws and different policy conversations. Taina, thank you so much.
Post-COVID, we want cupcakes.
You got it. You got it. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real joy to join the 2 of you today.
All right. Thank you, Taina.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to The Prison Post, a production of the Crop Organization. We'll be sharing more stories from the world of prison reform and restorative justice, so please join us. You can listen to The Prison Post on all major podcasting platforms. Subscribe to our video cast on YouTube and like us on Facebook at The Prison Post and at Creating Restorative Opportunities and Programs.